Chapter 21. At 6:15, the doorbell rang. Lacey headed for the door, only to be cut off by Gerard. She threw her hands in the air, growled, and headed back into the living room. Having him around when she'd just gotten used to doing things for herself was at times a bit annoying.
"Ah, Mr. Matthews."
Gerard's greeting flowed into the living room. Lacey spun around and headed back toward the entryway to meet Nick. She reached for his hands, ignoring how good they felt, and asked,
"Are you responsible for Tasha's release?"
"She's here, then?" He entwined their fingers, absent-mindedly caressing hers. She nodded, feeling the heat creeping up her neck.
"I'm sorry."
She pulled her hands from his and looked away.
"I'm just so grateful,"
she said, fumbling around the words.
"You didn't have to get involved in my family's troubles."
She went back to the living room, and he followed.
"Nick!"
Camille and Tasha were instantly on their feet, rushing across the room to greet him.
"Sorry I'm late, ladies."
He could have been speaking to any or all of them, for all Lacey knew.
"I had a bit of a crisis at the restaurant that needed my attention before I could leave for the evening."
"My, aren't we modest?" Camille said, completely enamored.
"You're not going to get arrested next, are you?"
Tasha asked playfully. Nick chuckled and shook his head. He reached into his pocket and came out with a regular-size envelope. "You'll find the memory cards that were in the photographer's camera and camera case in this envelope." Tasha's mouth dropped open as she slipped the envelope from Nick's hand. She looked inside and then back up at him.
"Thank you,"
she said softly.
"You're welcome."
She glanced back up at Nick with a hint of anxiety shading her blue eyes darker.
"You don't suppose he has copies, do you?"
"I couldn't say," Nick said. "But Parker knows me well enough to know what I'll do to him if those photographs show up in any newspapers, magazines, or anywhere online." Nick gave Tasha a nod and a soothing glance. "And he wouldn't dare have me arrested."
"Well,"
Tasha's voice exuded confidence and relief.
"whatever you've got on Mr. Parker, you have my undying gratitude."
She flicked the envelope against the fingertips of her other hand as she waltzed back to the couch and plopped down. Nick looked at Lacey.
"Can I talk to you?"
he asked in a lowered voice.
"Sure,"
she said, and waited for him to say something. When he didn't, she added,
"You want to talk out on the terrace?"
He nodded.
"That'd be fine."
Neither of them said anything on the way out. Nick closed the sliding glass door, and Lacey became overwhelmed with a feeling of doom. He wouldn't walk out on her now, would he?
"Is everything okay?"
she asked.
"I don't want you to worry,"
he said, and smiled.
"But I've been thinking."
His words trailed off. Was Tasha being arrested for assaulting the press too much for him? Did he not want to get mixed up with this crazy family? And better yet, what did he have on this Parker guy? It wasn't like Nick had any money to buy him off. Nick was up to his ears in debt. He hadn't wanted to tell her that, but Davis had looked into him, probably because he'd been ordered to by Julian. Lacey didn't kid herself for a minute that her big brother didn't know everything that was going on out here in California. Davis had told her this morning, before Nick came over, all about what Jenny had done to him. Of course, Lacey didn't want to crush what was left of Nick's pride, so she kept on pretending she was still in the dark. Sooner or later, Nick was going to have to open up to her.
"How did you get that guy to drop the charges and hand over those memory cards?"
she asked, casually enough. "Let's just say," he said smoothly, "that money isn't always the only motivating factor."
"How much did you have to lay out? Be honest, please."
$1,000.
"I'll pay you back as soon as the bank opens."
"That's not necessary." He sucked in a breath and finally released it, saying, "I'm not the kind of guy who marries a girl for money. I'm the kind of guy who blackmails jerks like Parker on behalf of innocent women and children and expects nothing in return for it." He gave Lacey a piercing look that not even Tasha could have ignored. That bad feeling in Lacey's gut swelled. She didn't know if it was because it sounded like Nick was simply walking away, or if he was walking away and that made her sad.
You're not going to marry me, are you?
I'm not the kind of guy who will throw you to the wolves, either. He shook his head slowly. What I will do is, I will marry you for, say, 6 months, so that your father can't have you deported. I will take your money, because I need it desperately, but only in exchange for 10% ownership and hang 10. A million objections for why that was not a fair deal for him rambled through Lacey's mind, and she was about to start voicing them, one after the other, when Nick said, "That's my final offer." If there was one thing Nick had learned in his short but eventful acquaintance with Lacey and her family, it was that you could accomplish just about anything if you had enough money and were willing to spend it. And boy, these people did, and they were. Davis, the attorney, had arranged it all with very little inconvenience to Lacey or her sisters-in-law. 15 minutes after the minister showed up, Nick found himself married, with the minister prompting him to kiss his bride. Granted, the thought left him feeling a little awkward, but he did it. He had to drop his head a little to press his lips against Lacey's. Hers were soft, too soft, and enticing. 10 minutes later, with the marriage license signed, Davis and the minister split, and Nick couldn't help but feel overwhelmed by all that had transpired in such a short amount of time. While the women laughed and chatted, he slipped outside and sat down on the terrace, right beside the fire pit where he and Lacey had hashed out the details not that long ago. The image of the way the fire had cast its glow over her face wouldn't let him go. She was pretty, but it was more than that. Something about her had caught his heart the moment Dean shoved her in his face a few days ago. Something that was growing in his gut. It wasn't a sickening feeling. No, it was much better than that. Forget it, he coached himself. He wasn't in this girl's league. Once her infatuation with America was over, she'd be on to something else. He'd do well to remember that. Eventually, she was going to leave him behind. "Hey!" Her voice drifted up beside him warmly. He cleared his throat and tried to hide his face, as if she could read his thoughts. "You all right?" she asked, sitting beside him on the couch. "Yeah," he smiled and looked at her. "You?" "I'm fine. Thanks to you." She chuckled. "Won't Papa be surprised when he finds out?" "I guess this is the wrong time to be asking this," he said with a flash of humor. "But your fathers and brother aren't going to try to kill me, are they?" "No," she shook her head. "Papa will bellow and tell Julian and Andre to handle it. But what he doesn't know is my brothers have been in on this since the beginning." She pulled the cashier's check from her pocket and handed it to him. "You really don't have to give me any part of your restaurant, you know?" "Yes, I do." He took the check and slipped it into his pocket without looking at it. "Is there anything I can do for you?" he asked. "Just don't do anything to give away our secret." Chapter 22. The next morning, Camille, Tasha, and the kids scurried around the house getting ready to leave. The whole thing was disheartening for Lacey. Deidre came into the living room and went straight to Lacey. She was wearing a horrified look on her face. "What's wrong?" Lacey asked, uncertainty and dread washing over her. "I just got a call from my father." Tears began to water her eyes. "He said my grandmother is in the hospital." Lacey's breath caught in her throat. Mavis Ferguson was everything to Deidre. "Is it serious?" "He just said I should come right away." A trail of tears dripped from each of Deidre's eyes. Lacey gestured toward Camille. "You can drop her off in Florida, right?" "Of course we can," Camille said, without hesitation. "I haven't even packed." Deidre shook her head. "I don't want to hold you up." "Nonsense." Camille went to her side and laid a gentle hand on her arm. "Go pack," she said with an easy nod toward the stairs. "The great thing about owning your own plane is that it leaves when you want it to." Half an hour later, Deidre, Camille, Tasha, and the kids were gone, leaving Lacey alone in the house for the very first time, save the butler, the cook, and a brand-new, fake husband. On Monday, Nick spent the entire morning going around to his creditors and paying off his debts. The bank was his last stop, and the manager hadn't been as impressed as Hang Ten's suppliers when Nick offered a certified check, so there was no fear of it bouncing, to settle his debts. The bank manager simply shot Nick a cold stare, saying, "I don't know what you did to get this money." "Well, nothing illegal, I promise you that." "I'm glad to hear that." He blew out a sigh and sat down at his desk. "We here at Golden West can sympathize with your situation," he said, but there was a bite in his tone. Nick didn't figure he felt any sympathy at all. "I'm glad that things worked out in your favor." "So you'll reinstate my line of credit?" Nick asked. "Yes," he nodded, "but with restrictions." "Restrictions?" "Well, for the first 30 days, we're going to put a cap on the amount you'll be able to access." While Nick understood the bank's caution, he couldn't understand their reasoning. What good was a line of credit if you couldn't use it? "Let's cut to the chase," he said, growing tired of the maze they were having him run through. "What's the bottom line?" $5,000. $5,000? Are you kidding me? That wouldn't help Nick with the community center at all. "So I don't suppose the bank would be interested in funding a loan for a piece of property." Nick all but laughed, already knowing the answer. Nick walked into Hang Ten, greeting the staff with long overdue smiles as he made his way to his office. Finally, thanks to Lacey, he was feeling upbeat and confident that everything was going to be okay. Oh, sure, it could have gone better at the bank, but in 30 days they would release his full line of credit to him, and they'd told him they'd talk about the community center at that time. It'd be cutting it close, but if they gave him a loan then, he could still make that 45-day deadline. Before sitting down at his desk, he went back to the door and opened it, glancing at a waitress as she passed by. "Could you bring me a pitcher of ice water, please?" he asked. Diane nodded. "Sure thing, Nick." He closed the door and went back to his desk. There was something to be said for being able to sit down and not have to worry about whether or not this would be the last time he'd sit here as the owner of Hang Ten. Again, thanks to Lacey. He should do something for her, since she'd been down in the dumps the last couple of days, ever since Deidre, Camille, and Tasha left. He grabbed the phone and hit number 1 on the speed dial. Ginny used to have that spot, but he'd given it to Lacey last week. The only list Ginny rated on these days was his shit list. Nick smiled when her smooth, sweet voice greeted him with a nice, "Hello." "Hi, it's me, Nick." He felt as awkward as a teenage geek who had a crush on the head cheerleader.
"Well, hello there. How's your day going?"
"Couldn't be better," he said, as Diane came in with the pitcher of water and a chilled glass. He motioned to his desk. "Hang on a sec, love," he said for Diane's benefit. He didn't mind people thinking he and Lacey were in love. It helped to kill the sting of everyone's pitying looks after Ginny had left him hanging. Diane poured him a glass before setting it and the pitcher on the desk, then nodded and backed away. When she closed the door, Nick said, "Sorry, one of the waitresses came in."
"I completely understand."
"Say, do you want to have dinner with me tonight?"
He sipped the water.
"I don't mean at the house. Out somewhere. Somewhere where people can see us."
"Sounds fun. I'd love to."
Lacey spent the entire afternoon getting ready for her date with Nick. She knew it wasn't a real date, but even so, she was looking forward to it. Rummaging through her closet, she'd pull a dress out on its hanger, hold it up against her to ponder it for a moment, then put it back on the rack and moved on to the next.
"I wonder what Nick's favorite color is."
She pulled out a blue Reese bandage dress she'd gotten in London last fall. Every time she wore it, she got compliments because it brought out her eyes. Sure, it wasn't a Versace or Dior, but it was fresh and hip like her, or at least the way she wanted to be. She took the dress and went to the nearest mirror in the bathroom and held it up against her. She did like the dress, and so did everyone else, especially men. Well, at least the ones who weren't related to her. She draped the hanger on the hook beside the door of the master suite's massive closet. She checked her nails and decided the manicure she'd gotten last week still looked good. Lacey's heart pounded at the thought of going on an actual date with Nick. But it wasn't a real date. He simply had the forethought to keep up appearances to keep this charade going. She'd do well to remember that. Maybe she'd go soak in a hot bath. That'd produce the same effect as a cold shower, right? Half an hour later, Lacey pushed herself to get out of the bathtub before she shriveled up like a prune. After relaxing in her bathrobe for a while, she checked her watch, surprised that it was already 4:45. That didn't give her much time. Nick had said he'd be at the house by 5:30, and their dinner reservation was for 6. She scrambled around the vanity in her dressing room, dusted a little powder on her face, and a little blush after that. Lacey thanked God every day for the near-flawless skin he'd seen fit to grace her with. It made it easy to use very little makeup and still look presentable. Just about the time she slipped into her dress, she heard the echo of footsteps out in the hallway.
"Lacey,"
Nick's voice filtered in.
"In here,"
she called from her room, conveniently located right across the hall from his, or inconveniently, depending on how you saw it. Usually, especially at night, she found it an inconvenience. It was too easy to dream about running across the hall to throw herself at him. But today she found it a convenience. She crept toward the door, which she'd left cracked open on purpose, peeked out and said, "I'm almost ready." Their eyes met, and he smiled, saying, "No hurry." Pointing over his shoulder toward his room, he added, "I'm just going to take a quick shower. I'll be down in 10 minutes. With that, he disappeared inside his room. Lacey picked out some modest sapphires, a matching necklace, bracelet, and earrings, put them on, and went downstairs to wait for Nick. Nick stopped at the entrance of the living room wearing a dark gray 2-button suit. It wasn't Armani, but damn, he sure made it look good on his tall, athletic frame. She stood when he walked into the room. He took her hand and looked at her admiringly. "Damn, girl." He shook his head as a devilish smile curled up the corners of his mouth. "You look fantastic."
"Thanks."
She couldn't help but grin at his praise, but she still glanced away shyly. She was in danger of getting wrapped up in Nick Matthews so swiftly that she wouldn't even know what hit her. She didn't understand Jenny at all. "You want to take your car?" he asked. "My truck is probably a little too messy for that dress." Lacey nodded, handing her car keys over to Nick, and they headed out. He took her to the Carbon Beach Club, a 4-star restaurant, yet reasonably priced, up in Malibu. They sat on the restaurant's terrace, and dinner was divine, not because of the service or the atmosphere. Lacey had been wined and dined in far more luxurious surroundings, but there was something to be said for sitting across the table from Nick Matthews, even if it was all for show. They dined on a simple 2-course meal. He had a steak and salad. She had the soup and chicken. She could have gone for the lobster, but Nick, she knew, was on a budget, and she didn't want him thinking she was an extravagance he couldn't afford. When the waiter laid the check at Nick's side, Lacey said, "Thanks for bringing me out. I confess I've not quite known what to do with myself with Deidre gone. Life just doesn't seem to be quite as much fun without friends."
"Yeah."
Lacey sighed and looked back up at Nick.
"I hope that you and I can remain friends after all this is over."
"You can count on it." He nodded and winked at her. "Oh, I have something for you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a black velvet jewelry box, the size that rings come in. "These will carry some weight toward authenticity." Lacey's heart hammered against her chest. But then she remembered that any ring Nick gave her would be rooted in the effectiveness of their ruse. Caution prompted her to take care when reaching for the box. It's not like it would burn her or anything, but Lacey didn't want to get carried away. Sooner or later, this marriage would end, and Nick would leave. She'd have to remember that. She opened the box to a full set of matching wedding rings, including a man's ring. There were lots of diamonds on hers. Not as flashy as Camille's and Tasha's rings, but these had a benefit theirs didn't. Nick was attached to them.
"Oh my, you shouldn't have gone to so much extravagance," she said, closing the case. "I'll reimburse you. This whole thing, after all, is for my benefit."
"I wouldn't hear of it." He shook his head. "Besides, I bought them at a pawn shop. It wasn't really that expensive."
"Are you sure?"
Nick took the box, opened it up, and took out the man's ring, slipping it on his left ring finger. Then he took her set and reached for her left hand. "Nobody's benefited in this deal more than me," he said, sliding the rings on her finger. The next morning, Gerard served Lacey and Nick breakfast on the terrace just off the side of the house. It was a picture-perfect setting, except for one thing. It wasn't real. Even so, Lacey stared at the diamonds sparkling on her left hand. They weren't much by de Laurent standards, but still she adored them. It saddened her a little that they weren't representative of the real thing, but at least she was getting a taste of what it'd be like to be happily married. Now she understood completely why Camille and Tasha put up with Julian and Andre. Gerard laid the paper beside Nick's plate, and after a few minutes, Nick grabbed it and opened it up. He peered over the top of the paper and said, "You want to come down to Hang 10 tonight? I have to work, but we could have dinner." "Sure," she nodded. He smiled and went back to the paper, thumbing through the pages. Every once in a while he'd stop and read something. She wondered what sections of the paper aroused his interest the most. He was probably a sports guy. Most Americans were. Some liked certain sports better than others. She wondered if he had his favorites. Probably. And how about business? Did he read that section too? He was, after all, a businessman, and from what she could tell, a damn good one. No doubt about it, his restaurant was highly successful. "Holy shit!" came roaring out of Nick's mouth. Lacey looked up, a bit startled. The paper was still between them. After a second or two, he folded the paper open and turned it around to face her. "How did this happen?" Chapter 23. Inside his office at Hang 10, Nick still marveled at the notion that his and Lacey's picture, a picture of them having dinner last night, was in the paper with an announcement that Nick Matthews, proprietor of the popular seaside restaurant Hang 10, had married into the affluent de Laurent family from France. When Dean threw him Lacey's way, Nick had no idea that she had the kind of wealth the paper was talking about. It made Nick more glad than ever that she'd hooked up with him instead of some scoundrel who'd end up trying to take advantage of her. Bethany, one of the waitresses, passed by Nick's open door. She stopped and smiled. "Nice, boss." He gave her one of those "what are you talking about" looks. "She's sweet, pretty, and rich." Bethany shot him a devilish grin. He chuckled. "I take it you approve?" It was no secret that Bethany, or any of the staff for that matter, hadn't liked Jenny. Not at all. "Very much," she said, and moved on. A few minutes later, Dean came in. "Have you seen the paper?" he asked, stalking across the room. Nick nodded. "Did you know who she is?" Dean sat down. "I mean, really know who she is? No more than you." Dean started laughing. Hard. "What's so funny?" Dean shook his head. "I was just thinking." He looked Nick in the eye. "Can you imagine the look on Jenny's face when she sees the paper?" "I seriously doubt that Jenny's within range of the Times." For the first time, or at least the first time that Nick realized it, talking about Jenny no longer stung. Well, at least not as much as it had last week. "I hope the bank manager sees the paper today," Nick chuckled. If there was one instant where he'd like to capitalize on being married into such wealth, that was it. Maybe it'd help him get a loan to buy the community center and the land it sat on. "Yeah," Dean agreed. He had as much invested in the center as Nick. In fact, Dean's job depended on them finding a way to purchase the center. Nick glanced at his watch. It was nearly noon. Good. Lacey should be here soon. "What?" Dean joked. "You got a lunch date?" "Yes, as a matter of fact, I do." Nick got up and ushered Dean toward the door. "Don't you have something to do?" "No." A wide grin spread over Dean's face. "As a matter of fact, I don't. I think I'll have lunch with you and the little missus." "No, you're not." Nick nudged Dean out into the dining room. Hey, wait, how about her friend Deidre? He asked seriously. Don't those rich chicks hang out together? He was only trying to get a rise out of Nick, which is why Nick wasn't accommodating. Goodbye, Dean. I'll see you later. Minutes after Dean left, Lacey arrived. Nick's heart danced at the sight of her. He maneuvered his way around the tables to greet her at the front door. Right on time. You hungry? Lord knew he was. She nodded and tossed him a smile that instantly lifted his spirits. Nick chose a table near his office, away from the windows, now that he realized he and Lacey were on the press's radar. He pulled her chair out and waited for her to sit. Then he sat next to her. Bethany was at their side as soon as Nick's bottom hit the chair, delivering a glass of ice water for Nick and an iced tea for Lacey. The usual? Bethany asked Nick. He nodded and looked at Lacey. Yeah, Lacey nodded. I'm sticking with the crab cakes. They're awesome. Salads today? Bethany asked. Nick looked at Lacey. She nodded and said, Yes, I'm famished. Nick looked back at Bethany and held up 2 fingers. 2 Caesars. Minutes later, Bethany was back with 2 salads. Nick said, It's just starting to get busy. He looked around the dining room, which was beginning to fill. Just let me know when our lunches are up. I'll get them from the kitchen. Will do, boss, she said, and walked away. Nick had this fascinating light in his eyes like he used to before Ginny's shenanigans almost brought him to the brink of financial ruin. You really love running this place, don't you? Lacey asked, gazing around the restaurant. I do, he nodded. It shows. She paused, almost overcome with melancholy. I'd love to have something that meant so much to me. He looked at her like he was filled with pity for her. One of the waitresses, Diane, rushed up to the table. Carrie called. She's got the flu. Did you call Ashley? He asked. She's on vacation. She's in Texas. Cammy? Desperation filled his voice. Cammy was one of the part-time hostesses. She and Meredith worked on Carrie and Ashley's days off. Cammy's working her other job till the end of the week, Diane said. And Meredith is scheduled to take Ashley's shift starting tomorrow. She's working elsewhere today. Damn, Nick looked around. Can we get a waitress to fill in? We'll have to call somebody in, Diane said. I can do it, Lacey spoke up. You? Diane looked at her, surprised. Nick turned to Lacey. I can't ask you to do that. Why not? Lacey asked. Well, for one, I really don't think it's your cup of tea, Nick said. Lacey knew he was just being polite. He didn't think she could do it. What do I have to do? She asked. Seat people at a table and tell them their waitress will be right with them? How hard could that be? For the next 3 days, Lacey stumbled her way around the restaurant playing hostess. On the 3rd evening, when the restaurant was half an hour away from closing, Nick passed her by in the hallway outside the supply room. He pulled her inside. They stood inches apart. He gazed at her with adoration sparkling in his intoxicating brown eyes. I can't tell you how grateful I am for your help while Carrie's been sick. It was my pleasure, she said, even though I was a very poor stand-in. You were fantastic. He touched her cheek, caressing it. Thank you. For a second, she thought he was going to kiss her, but instead he smiled softly and backed away. Every time Lacey thought Nick was on the verge of getting closer to her, it was as though something went off inside his head, reminding him not to. But why? Probably because he was still in love with Ginny. Lacey would do well to remember that and stop letting herself get carried away by fantasies that were never going to come true. On Saturday, Nick was in his office running inventory numbers on the computer. He'd always found it a dull, drab job in the past, but he had a newfound appreciation for it after nearly losing Hang 10. He had Lacey to thank for that not happening. He'd grown quite accustomed to having her around, even in this short amount of time. He was about to chastise himself for that, knowing full well it was a bad idea, when Carrie appeared at the door, looking decidedly pale. "What's the matter?" he asked. "You not feeling well again?" He hoped that wasn't the case. He hated the thought of asking Lacey to play hostess again, especially on a Saturday. "No," she said weakly. "I'm fine." She cut her eyes to the left, out toward the dining room. "I'm not sure you're going to like this." "What?" He got up and moved toward her. "For God's sake, what are you talking about?" When he reached the door, Diane moved out of his way. He passed through the doorway, and his heart fell to the floor. Ginny. Chapter 24. Nick stood there staring at Ginny for at least 2 minutes, but it seemed like forever. After dragging his heart up off the floor, Nick said with a measure of anger, "You've got a lot of nerve coming back here." "Nicky." She cooed his name in a sugary sweet tone, sauntering toward him. Nick backed up, like she'd burn him if she got too close, but she kept coming. "Where the hell is my money?" he demanded, blocking the doorway to his office. She took on a pained expression and said, without remorse, "I spent it." She kept coming. Nick stiffened. "You cleaned me out." He raked his hand through his hair and stomped into the office. "You spent it all? What's it been, 3 weeks?" Ginny closed the door and let out an exasperated sigh. "Don't get all sanctimonious with me, Nick Matthews." She dropped down onto the couch against the far left wall and crossed her legs. "You married that cute little bank account within 2 weeks of me dumping you." Nick's anger seethed out in a growl. "You did not dump me. That suggests you called it off. You didn't. You simply left me standing at the altar, looking like a fool." "Oh, Nicky, don't be so melodramatic," she scoffed. "You and me, we're cut from the same cloth." "No, we're not." "Oh, yes, my love, yes, we are." She pushed herself up and went to him, standing between him and his desk. Why she did that he had no idea, but he followed her, wanting to keep his eye on her every move. Even though she no longer had legal access to his bank accounts, he didn't trust her. "I knew you couldn't get over me quickly enough to fall in love and marry someone else 2 weeks after our wedding was supposed to have taken place." She wrapped her arms around him and planted a kiss on his lips. The shock of it crippled him for a few seconds and stopped him from immediately shoving her off him, which is what anyone in full possession of their faculties would have done. First, horror, then hurt and humiliation coursed through Lacey as she stood there watching some woman kissing Nick. After a second or two, she summoned her pride and eased the door shut, as quietly as she'd opened it. The image of them kissing bounced around inside her head, looking for a place to land, but found none. It just kept knocking everything else aside. She could see or think of nothing but the two of them locked together. She felt faint and grabbed the wall for support. Carrie passed by. "Carrie," she said the name weaker than she'd intended. Carrie stopped at her side. "Hey, Lacey, it's great to see you again." "Likewise." Lacey pointed to the wall separating them from Nick's office and asked, as if it was no big deal, "Who's Nick in with?" She shook her head. "I heard somebody say Jenny was here." Her otherwise pretty face twisted into a vile expression. "I see." Lacey struggled to remain calm. "Maybe I'll just come back later." She stepped away from Nick's office door and looked over her shoulder. "Carrie," she said, and waited for the girl, who'd already gone on her way, to turn back around. Once she did, Lacey added, "No need to mention that I was here." Lacey forced a smile and moved on. "Of course Jenny was back," breezed through Lacey's thoughts as she pushed open the front door and headed outside. She blew out a breath that was half frustration, half disbelief. Lacey had been afraid of this from the beginning, but that didn't make it any easier to handle now. Quietly, she chastised herself for ever thinking she stood a chance against Jenny. "Oh, well," This whole marriage thing had been a good idea as far as thwarting Papa's deportation plans, but Jenny was back in the picture now. Lacey might as well go home and pack her bags. Once Nick regained his senses, he pried Jenny off of him and wiped his mouth, wanting to get rid of any lingering remnants of her kiss, which he now found utterly disgusting. He stuck his finger in her face and said, "Don't do that again."
"Come on, Nicky."
"Stop calling me that." He hated it when she called him that. Made him feel weak. He wasn't weak. Not anymore. She ignored him, saying,
"Don't you see? You've hit the jackpot."
There was a little too much excitement in her eyes, her face, her tone.
"She should be worth a nice payout."
Payout? What the hell was she talking about? Nick had a feeling he was going to find out.
"Think about it."
She gave an encouraging nod.
"You can get enough money out of her to set us up nicely."
Was Nick hearing her correctly? Was she suggesting what he thought she was? No, it couldn't be so. Surely he'd misheard her.
"Come again?" "You and me, Nicky, we can be together," she said urgently. "And she can provide the way."
Nick's entire body filled with contempt. It started at his feet and didn't stop even when it reached the top of his head. It just kept coming. The contempt. Contempt for Jenny. And it poured out with this single-word inquiry.
"What?"
"Oh, good Lord, Nicky," she huffed.
"We need money, lots of it. You can get it from her."
"1 second," he said, much calmer than before. He took her by the arm, near the elbow, escorted her from his office and through the dining room. Opening the front door, he said, "Don't ever come back here again." He nudged her outside and pointed an accusatory forefinger at her. "Next time, I call the police."
"You can't have me arrested," she snorted. "You gave me access to your bank accounts."
"And that was my mistake," he nodded. "One I've rectified." He sucked in a breath. "I also had a restraining order issued against you, and you're not to come near me, my wife, or hang 10. He paused to let that sink in, then flashed her a smile. "Don't believe I'll call him? Try me." Lacey stormed into the house and dropped her keys on the table in the foyer. She went into the living room to plop down on the couch, ready to give herself a good cry. She wished Deidre were here. She'd know what to do. She dug her phone out of her purse and set the call. Maybe Deirdre's grandmother was doing better now, and Deidre could come home. Funny that Lacey now considered California home.
"Yes?"
It was Deidre's voice, but it was soft, barely above a whisper, and it sounded like she was crying. Maybe it was just that Lacey felt like crying.
"Deidre?"
"Lacey," Deidre sobbed.
"Oh, Lacey, my Grams died."
"What?" Lacey felt the tears pricking her eyes.
"I'm on my way."
Lacey went upstairs, randomly tossed clothes into a suitcase, and made sure she grabbed her passport on the way out. Not that she planned to leave the country, not just yet anyway, but she wasn't sure she was coming back here either. The cell phone in her hand chimed. She looked at the display. Her heart fell. Nick. She wasn't ready to hear him say that Jenny, the woman he loved, was back. But she had to answer it. She shouldn't just disappear on him. That was something Jenny would do, and she was better than that.
"Hello,"
she said breathlessly. "It's me."
"I can't talk right now."
"Okay, I'm headed to your house. We need to talk."
"No,
Lacey couldn't handle this right now."
"It'll have to wait, Nick."
She tried to suppress the anguish of never wanting to hear those words.
"I'm headed to the airport. I'll be back as soon as I can."
"I'd really like to talk to you before you leave." His voice had taken on a somber quality. "Can you take a later flight?" Lacey shook her head.
"No, Deidre's grandmother has died. I have to get to her."
It took a second before he said,
"I understand."
and then he went silent again. When he did speak again, his tone was touched with remorse.
"Please give Deidre my condolences. I'll see you when you get back."
Nick dropped the receiver back onto the phone cradle and leaned back in the chair. He glanced around his office at Hang Ten, wondering why fate was so determined to pick on him. "Story of my life," he said out loud. But Lacey wouldn't disappear on him like Jenny had. Would she? No, she wasn't anything like Jenny. He'd missed the signs with Jenny the first time around, but he wasn't biting on that hook again. And he'd been deadly serious about calling the police if she showed her face again. He didn't want Jenny anywhere near Lacey. He'd made a deal with Lacey, and he wouldn't have Jenny screwing it up. Maybe it was a good thing that Lacey was headed out of town. A week or two away from here would give Nick time to figure out how to get rid of Jenny for good. Chapter 25. 3 weeks later. Nick Matthews wondered if someone had put a curse on him. His luck lately was just that bad. Although he hadn't seen Jenny in over 2 weeks, not since the cops had talked to her, the next day she'd checked out of her motel and hadn't been seen around town since. Nick hoped she'd stayed gone this time. The only positive thing that had graced his life lately was Lacey, but she wasn't in it for the long haul. He was just a means to an end for her. He'd thought, when she came into the picture, that luck was beginning to shine upon him again since she'd bailed him out financially. If that had been the case, it was temporary, because the bank had pulled the rug out from under him this morning. He'd heard their big, fat, resounding no about a loan for the community center loud and clear. He walked into his office at Hang Ten and slammed the door. Storming across the room toward his desk, he tried to temper his anger, having minimal success. Well, he'd best pick up the phone and deliver the bad news. He didn't like it, but he grabbed the receiver off its cradle and hit the speed dial for the community center. After hearing Dean's voice, Nick said, "The bank said no."
"Please tell me you're kidding,"
Dean said.
"I wish I could."
Nick swabbed his hand over his forehead. "I'm out of options."
"You could ask Lacey."
"No, not even for the community center." Nick figured he'd already taken advantage of her enough as it was. "We'll find another way. She won't be it."
"It was just a thought."
There was silence on the line for a few seconds. Then Dean said,
"Listen, I'll come over to the restaurant later. We'll figure out a way to fix this."
Dean hung up the phone and stared at the picture hanging on the wall in his office at the community center. The photograph of Dean, Nick, and Kevin, taken about a month before Kevin overdosed. They hadn't seen it back then. At least, Dean hadn't, and as far as he knew, neither had Nick. But Kevin was high as a kite when the picture was snapped. And now he and Nick were on the verge of losing the center, the legacy they'd built for Kevin. It was the one thing that brought meaning to Kevin's death. Without the center, they both knew he'd died in vain. A soft knock on the door dragged Dean out of his somber thoughts.
"Come on,"
he called out. The door opened, and Dean doubted he'd hide his shock when he saw Lacey coming in with a manila envelope in her hands. She greeted him with a smile and waited for him to invite her to sit. When he did, she offered him the envelope before sitting.
"What's this?"
he asked, taking it.
"I'm giving my interest in Hang Ten to the center." "Why?" "I've decided to return to France," she said. "And it's just not right for me to keep it."
"Then why don't you just give it back to Nick?"
"Because he'll never take it."
"Well," Dean slid the envelope across the desk toward her. "Don't turn it over to the center." He shook his head slowly. "We're going out of business."
"What do you mean, you're going out of business?"
She inched closer to his desk.
"This place is for sale."
He looked around and shrugged.
"And we can't afford to buy it." Once it goes on the market at the end of the week, it'll just be a matter of time before we're given an eviction notice." "Who's selling it?" she asked. "Juno Properties," Dean replied. But he didn't want to talk about the center. Talking about the center made him sad. It was time to change the subject. "Why are you going back to France?" he asked, mildly curious about the answer. "I thought that was the whole reason you and Nick got married, so you didn't have to go back yet." "Plans change," she said with a smile and shrug, but there was something sad about her countenance. Maybe she was regretting giving Nick all that money. "Nick can't possibly reimburse you for the money you gave him." Dean wanted her to know she could change her mind all she wanted, but she shouldn't expect anything back from Nick, not even a partial refund. "Oh, I know." She shook her head. "I'm not expecting a reimbursement." Okay, well, as long as she knew where she stood as far as the money was concerned, she could do whatever she wanted. But he couldn't help wondering why. What was the real reason? Dean had gotten the feeling that Lacey liked Nick just as much as Dean knew Nick liked her, but he didn't know Lacey well enough to ask. Once home, Lacey surveyed the house. It looked like Nick was still living there, but she couldn't understand why. He wouldn't bring Jenny to her house, would he? Of course not. Nick wasn't that kind of guy. Lacey might not like that Nick loved someone else, but deep down she knew he was an upstanding guy. So why was he still here? Well, he had entered into a contract with her. He was probably trying to uphold it. It's just that Lacey couldn't let him lose his chance to get back with the woman he loved. She dug her cell phone out of her purse and called his number. "Lacey, I'm so glad you're back." His voice slipped over her like smooth silk. Yes, I am." It pierced her heart to think that soon, very soon, she wouldn't be hearing his voice anymore. "How's Deidre? Did she come with you?" "She's taking care of some last-minute details," Lacey said. "She'll be here tomorrow." And they'd be leaving for France by the end of the week. She just had to figure out a way to get Nick to take back the percentage of Hang 10 that he'd given her. "Are you very busy?" she wondered. "I really need to talk to you." "I can be at the house in 5, he said. Lacey disconnected the call and tossed her phone onto the couch. She drew in a deep breath, hoping it'd bring her enough courage to keep her dignity about her and not make a fool of herself when Nick arrived. "Just remember," she coached herself, "he loves someone else." She prayed Jenny didn't insist on coming along. The 5 minutes it took Nick to get there was just enough time for Lacey to admit her mistake. She should never have let herself get mixed up with him in the first place. She might be young and a little naive, but she knew full well the feelings she'd had for Nick before she let Camille and Tasha talk her into asking Dean, Nick's best friend, to marry her. Nick rushed through the front door, hardly able to believe how excited he was that Lacey was back. He shouldn't be, and for more reasons than that it was a bad idea to get hooked on her, but he was. It shouldn't matter to him, but her being back was the one thing that made the prospect of losing the community center bearable. She was standing by the fireplace, trying to smile. He was probably still feeling the effects of Deidre's grandmother's passing. "Lacey!" He went to her and wrapped his arms around her. That was a bad idea, too, but he did it anyway. "I'm so glad you're home." She was a little reluctant at first, but after a couple of seconds, her arms wrapped slowly around him until finally she held on like she was holding on for dear life. That made Nick's heart sing. "Everything go okay while I was gone?" She pulled away and went to the couch. He followed her. "Did I miss anything?" Nick sat beside her and shook his head. "It was pretty boring around here without you." "So, what did you want to talk to me about?" she asked. She was so distant, so aloof, and Nick had to wonder why. What happened to the fun-loving girl who lit up like a Christmas tree every time he came into the room? Where was that girl? Nick wanted her back. "Oh, it was nothing," he chuckled, buying time to come up with something plausible.
I just wanted to take you out to dinner." He was making it up as he went along. He liked that idea, so he ran with it. "To show my appreciation for you stepping in and helping out at the Hang Ten." For a second, she looked at him like she didn't believe him. But before he got around to throwing out a few more sensible explanations, she said, in a sad, lonely sort of tone, "You're such a nice guy, Nick." He didn't know what to make of that. That's the phrase most girls use when they're getting ready to dump you. But if she dumped him, where would that leave her? She couldn't be dumping him, at least not yet. "Well, you did a good thing, and you deserve to be rewarded." "So do you." She nodded, and seemed so sad about something. Deidre's grandmother? He had no way of knowing. She looked like she was about to cry when she said, "I've been awfully selfish." She shook her head and turned away from him. "You? Selfish?" he said, on the edge of impatience. "You don't have a selfish bone in your body, girl." "I took advantage of you." She looked at him. "I shouldn't have done that." "What do you mean you took advantage of me?" He laughed nervously. "I knew you needed money." "I'm responsible for my own actions," he said. "You didn't twist my arm. I entered into this agreement as a willing participant." "Yes, and now you're stuck." She stared at him with a blank look. "Just for a few more months." He paused. "Then we're both free to do as we please." "A lot can happen in a few months." She shook her head. "I shouldn't hold you to that." "We made a deal, signed a contract." Nick spoke in a steady, lower-pitched voice. "I take that kind of thing seriously." "Look, if you want out," she said, "all you have to do is say the word, and we'll end this thing tomorrow." "End it tomorrow?" Nick sucked in a deep breath. If they ended it tomorrow, how was he ever going to pay her back for all that money? Money that he'd mostly already spent. As if she'd read his thoughts, she said, "Don't worry. I don't expect any refund on time not spent." He wanted to ask her what brought this on, but who was Nick to grill her about anything? She could do as she pleased. That was an advantage of being super rich. When you get bored with one thing, you drop it and move on to the next. It wasn't like she was actually dumping him. She'd never promised to stay by his side forever, just 6 months. But Nick was learning that even when you entered into a contract marriage, anything could happen. At least, Lacey showed up for the wedding. Chapter 26. Dean looked at Nick like he'd lost his mind. Nick felt the need to repeat himself, if for nothing other than clarity's sake. "I'm not joking. I got home yesterday and she's trying to let me off the hook." Nick shook his head. "Maybe she found someone else while she was in Florida, and I'm just in the way now." "She came by the center," Dean said. "Tried to give her share of Hang Ten to me. Well, the center. She said you'd never take it back willingly." "And she's right. I told her so yesterday, especially if she's ready to cancel our agreement. I have no way to pay her back the money I've already spent." "Have you asked her why she's leaving?" "No." Nick didn't think he had the right. "Besides, I really don't want to hear about how she's found someone else." "Yeah, maybe," Dean nodded. "But I just can't help thinking that this is a tactical error of some sort." "Let's face it." Nick laughed at himself. "I'm just way out of my league with this one. Whoever caught her attention, I hope he's worthy of her." "Well," Dean stood, "I need to start looking for a job." He shook his head. He and Nick both knew how hard that was going to be in this economy. "If there's anything I can do to help." Nick's voice trailed off. Dean nodded and headed for the door. If it wasn't one thing, it was another. Nick had thought things were going to turn around after Lacey walked into his life, but that wasn't meant to be. She was walking out and taking every ounce of available hope with her. He was losing Lacey and the center at the same time. The fact that he still had the Hang Ten, thanks to her, was little comfort. 2 days later, Nick was in his office tending to the daily needs of the Hang Ten when Dean's call came in.
"I'm kind of busy right now," Nick said to Dean. "Can I call you later?"
"This can't wait."
Dean's troubled voice reached across the airwaves and yanked Nick up by the throat.
"All right," Nick said, straightening in his chair.
"It's happened."
"What's happened?"
"Somebody bought the center."
Nick closed his eyes and dropped his head into his hand. "Well, that's that then."
"Hey, don't beat yourself up, man,"
Dean said.
"You kept this place going for an awful long time."
"Yes, but it was supposed to be forever," Nick said. "For Kevin's sake." Dean Triplett let his gaze wander around the common area of the Kevin Matthews Community Center. It wouldn't bear that name for much longer. Who knew what the new owners would end up doing with the piece of prime real estate? Probably demo the building and throw up some fancy high-rise or something. Dean shook his head, went to his office, and closed the door. He knew they'd be coming, the new owners, any day to personally issue his eviction notice. But he was still the center's director, even if it was just for today. Sitting down at his desk, he thought about all the things he should be doing. Settling the center's final debts as much as he could, figuring out what to do with all the furnishings and such, and finding a new job. Dean blew out a sigh. He didn't feel like doing any of those things, especially when it came to a new job. He liked this one just fine. Silently, he cursed Jenny, even though she wasn't directly responsible for the property being sold out from under the center, but she was to blame for Nick's unstable financial status. That much he could pin on her. A soft knock echoed through the door. One of the kids? Dean went to see who. Opening the door, he was surprised to see Lacey. Again. "Hey!" He tried to smile, but there wasn't much to smile about. She had another large manila envelope with her. More documents, he supposed. She gave him a smile, then said,
"I hope I'm not disturbing you."
He shook his head.
"Not at all."
He gestured to the chair in front of his desk.
"What can I do for you?"
Funny he'd be asking her that. She was the one who could have helped him and Nick, if Nick would have just asked her for a loan. But Nick wouldn't hear of it, wouldn't even entertain it. Dean shook the nasty thoughts out of his head and went back to his seat behind the desk. He really couldn't blame this on Nick, or Lacey. It was nobody's fault, just fate being a bitch. When he peered up at her, he saw it. She was fretting over something. He just couldn't figure what.
"Nick wouldn't take back his interest in the Hang Ten, huh?"
He pointed to the envelope she was carrying.
"No."
Lacey raised her eyebrows and let out a little laugh.
"Well, I wish we could take it off your hands, but like I said..."
Dean shook his head.
"Never mind. I shouldn't be bothering you with my troubles."
"What do you mean?"
she asked.
"You may not remember, but I mentioned it the other day."
Dean had a hard time hiding the pain this whole thing was causing him.
"The center is being sold out from under us."
Lacey smiled. Awfully pissy of her, and out of character. That was something more likely to come from Jenny.
"By now,"
Dean said, hoping to make her feel bad,
"I should have new computers for the kids to use."
He glared at her, trying to project his pain onto her.
"Instead, all I have for them is bad news. Somebody's already bought the center and the land it sits on. I'm sure our eviction notice is imminent."
As if undaunted by his statement, she said,
"That's why I'm here."
She laid the envelope on the desk and pushed it toward him.
"I purchased this property."
"You?"
Dean asked, unable to hide his shock.
"Well," Lacey paused, "I bought it on behalf of the Kevin Matthews Foundation."
"You did what?"
Dean asked her again, just to make sure he'd heard right. This was too good to be true.
"Well, you said the other day the place was up for sale."
Her cheeks blushed pink.
"Considering all that's happened lately, I figured Nick might have a hard time coming up with the money. I have plenty of money, and it seemed like a worthy cause."
She looked at Dean, her eyes widening.
You don't think he's going to be mad, do you? Maybe we shouldn't tell him it was me?"
Dean laughed.
"The minute I tell him the Kevin Matthews Foundation now owns this center, he's going to know it was you."
"Well, okay."
She looked at Dean.
"Can you wait until I've gone back to France to confirm it?"
"Tell you what."
He got up.
"I won't volunteer any information."
He moved around the desk.
"But if he asks me point blank, I won't lie."
She stood.
"Fair enough."
"I can't begin to thank you."
He wrapped her in a friendly embrace.
"You are an angel."
"Hardly."
She laughed, and they parted.
"You're definitely an angel,"
Dean said. And Nick was going to think she was an angel, too. Maybe this would be the thing that urged Nick to get off his butt and stop this girl from leaving. Nick checked his watch. 1:30. Chip from Budweiser should be back from lunch by now. He needed to get that order in, or Hang Tim is going to be very short on beer this weekend. Things had been far easier when Jenny was around handling all these office-type duties for the restaurant. Of course, she was also not paying the bills. He shook his head and snatched up the phone. Better that she was gone anyway. Now that everything was straightened out financially, maybe he could hire someone to be his office manager. He'd damn sure keep a closer eye on things now, and he'd never, ever allow anyone, signatory rights to his bank accounts, much less add them as a joint owner. Lesson learned. He opened up the Rolodex to look for Chip's number. A rat-a-tat-tat at the door claimed his attention. Before he had time to respond to the jovial knock, the door opened and Dean came sashaying in.
"Good afternoon."
He was far too happy for someone who was about to become unemployed. Nick scrutinized him carefully, not missing the large manila envelope he was carrying.
"What's gotten into you?"
he asked, dropping the phone back onto its base.
"You find a new job already?" "Don't need to."
Dean sat, but stretched out like a proud peacock.
"Ah,"
Nick drew the word out. "So you're going to try the life of a beach bum for a while?"
"Check this out."
He slid the envelope across the desk to Nick.
"What's this?"
Nick asked, looking at it like it might be a booby trap.
"That, my friend, is salvation."
"Why don't you just give me the Cliff Notes?"
He looked at Dean.
"That,"
Dean pointed to the envelope,
"is the deed to the community center and the land it sits on."
Nick pushed it back across the desk toward Dean.
"You have to put this back where you found it."
Dean said,
"It was hand-delivered to me."
He pointed to the envelope.
"Look at the deed. The Kevin Matthews Foundation owns the property now."
"What?"
If this was a joke, Nick didn't find it funny. Would Dean do that? Nick had to admit, no. So if Dean was serious, and the center owned the property now, who would do such a thing? Who could do such a thing? Les see. Nick let out a long sigh. "Tell me you didn't ask her for a loan?"
"I did not."
"Then how did she know?"
Nick riffled through his own thoughts. Did he mention it to her? Not that he recalled.
"I wonder how much she had to pay for it, and what kind of terms she expects from us to pay it back."
"She donated it."
Nick's mouth dropped open.
"What? Why would she do that? You know, you're great at running this restaurant."
Dean shook his head.
"But sometimes you're dumber than a rock."
Nick continued to stare at him. He had no clue, no idea what Dean was talking about. Dean laughed a little, then said,
"She did it for you, you dumbass."
Nick considered it for about a half a second, and then dismissed the idea. "No way." He shook his head and kept shaking it, as if that'd shake the nonsense out of Dean's head, too.
"She doesn't care about me. She's leaving. Besides, girls like her don't fall in love with guys like you and me."
That much Nick was sure of. Their worlds couldn't be further apart. Chapter 27. Nick Matthews might not have been in the same league as Lacey de Laurent, but he sure was grateful for what she'd done for the community center, and he intended to tell her. And maybe they could come to a suitable arrangement regarding how he was going to pay her back. Walking up to the front door, he saw that the flowers she had asked the gardener to plant along the front of the house had started to bloom. Santa Barbara daisies amid African irises and the Matalia poppy added an elegance to the house's curbside appeal. Nick was going to miss this place. He was also going to have to put getting the loft above Hang 10 in livable shape at the top of his priority list. As soon as their marriage ended, he wouldn't be staying here anymore. Nick was going to miss Lacey. Nick went inside the house, feeling a little sad. "Lacey," he called out to her, but got no answer. He went through the house, but couldn't find her anywhere. She had to be here. Her car was in the garage. Standing at the sliding glass door off the living room, he looked out at the terrace. She wasn't there either. But what about that little patio just down the hill on the other side of the yard? He headed outside because that was the only place left to look. He was right, and felt a sense of peace when he saw her sitting on the little sofa with her back to him, gazing out at the ocean. "Admiring the view?" he asked, sitting down next to her. She nodded and looked at him. "I take it Dean has been to see you?" "Yes, he has." Nick looked at her, wanting to touch her, but he didn't dare. "I'll find a way to pay you back. I'll make payments, whatever you want." She shook her head. "No, it wasn't a loan." The slightest hint of pink stained her cheeks, and she turned back to look at the ocean again. "I did it for the kids." "Are you still leaving?" He wished she wouldn't, but he didn't have the guts to say so. She nodded. "I think it's for the best." She was probably right. They were both from different worlds. Nick wouldn't know how to begin to fit into hers. Still, he couldn't bear the thought of never seeing or hearing from her again. "You'll keep in touch, won't you?" he asked. "Let me know where to send your checks?" She looked at him with raised eyebrows. "That's the great thing about being a silent partner," he chuckled. "You don't have to do anything, but you still get paid." "Oh, the Hang 10, Lacey smiled, then shook her head. "I signed my interest in the restaurant over to the foundation as well. Now it will have a steady income to operate on." "I don't know what to say." And he truly didn't. Dean was right in his assessment of Lacey. She was an angel. She'd swooped in and saved him, just when he thought the devil had done him in for sure. But the angel had done her job, and now she was leaving, probably going on to do good for some other poor schmuck. "You don't have to say anything." She smiled, looking every bit the angel he now realized she was. One thing was for sure. No other woman would ever be able to do what Jenny had done to him, because Nick would always be in love with this one, the woman sitting next to him now. "Lacey," he sucked in a breath and looked at her. "I hope that you get everything in life that you want, because you deserve happiness more than anybody else I know." She looked at him, and for the first time he saw the sadness in her eyes. She smiled, a forced one, he thought, and said, "Listen, I'm leaving tomorrow, but you can stay here at the house for as long as you want." "I do appreciate that," he nodded. "I'm making plans to have the loft above Hang 10 renovated so I can live there." He couldn't help noticing her looking at him a little oddly, and wondered if she was only saying that about staying at the house to be nice. Maybe what she really wanted was for him to be out of her house ASAP. "It shouldn't take more than a week," he said, hoping to appease her. "As soon as it's done, I'll be out of your house." "There's no hurry." She shook her head and turned her focus back to the ocean. Nick looked her over and let his gaze linger on her a little longer. He wanted to remember everything about this moment, to commit every inch of her to memory. He never wanted to forget the way she looked right now, stunningly beautiful, yet somehow sad. the way she smelled of roses just after a summer rain, and most of all, the way he felt sitting here next to her. Deidre didn't exactly feel good about lying to Lacey, her best friend since first grade, but damn, the girl was determined to leave the States without telling Nick the real reason she was going. And Nick might not care one way or the other, but at least Deidre was going to know that she'd done everything possible to keep Lacey and Nick from parting on these terms. If there was one thing she'd learned from her grandmother's death, it was that life was short, and you couldn't leave things to fate. She pulled open Hang Ten's door, and a cool breeze wafted past her, carrying with it the scent of hamburgers and barbecue. "Hey, Deidre!" Diane waved and hurried past.
"Is Nick here?"
she called after the waitress.
"Yeah," she said over her shoulder. "He's in his office. Go on in."
Deidre nodded and proceeded onward. Her heart pounded against her chest, reminding her she was going behind Lacey's back. But that was beside the point. Deidre shook off her fear and knocked on the office door.
"Nick?"
Within seconds the door opened, and Nick was standing feet away, smiling.
"Hey, Deidre."
Almost instantly his brow furrowed, and his smile faded.
"I thought you and Lacey were leaving today."
"We are," she nodded. "But I wanted to talk to you before we go." Nick stepped back and waved her in. Once she was inside, he closed the door and motioned toward the couch on the left wall. She sat, then he sat. They remained silent for several seconds. Then Deidre sucked in a breath and asked, "Are you back together with Jenny?"
"What?"
Nick blurted out with genuine surprise. At least it looked genuine. Maybe Nick was in the wrong business. Perhaps he should consider acting.
"She saw you two kissing some weeks back,"
Deidre said, a little cooler than she would have liked. But no matter. It was done, and now Nick knew that feigning innocence was not going to work with her.
"She?"
he asked, still innocently.
"Lacey."
Deidre's tone held the bite.
"Oh, no."
Nick hung his head. So he was kissing Jenny. Deidre realized she'd been holding on to a sliver of hope that had somehow turned out to be a misunderstanding.
"She saw that?"
Nick asked, as if the outcome would somehow change. Deidre nodded emphatically.
"You know, it's probably none of my business, but how can you go back to her after what she did to you?"
"I'm not back with her." Nick shook his head.
"Well, you were kissing her."
"Technically, she kissed me." A vile nature had taken over Nick's voice now. It was as if the topic of Jenny had put a bad taste in his mouth. "And right after that, I escorted her out of the restaurant. And I didn't see Lacey here anywhere, mind you."
"Well,"
Deidre couldn't let go of her "I told you so" mindset.
"She saw you."
Nick was silent for several seconds. Then his eyes widened.
"Is that why she's leaving?"
Deidre nodded.
"What time does your plane leave?"
"The Delarant jet takes off tonight at 6. Nick looked like someone had stuck a pin in his favorite balloon. "I'm kidding myself," he said, shaking his head.
"Why?"
Deidre asked, her tone carrying a measure of hope. Obviously, Deidre knew something he didn't. Lacey liked him. In fact, Deidre suspected that Lacey was in love with Nick.
"She and I come from different worlds. She has a private jet at her disposal. I couldn't afford a deeply discounted ticket in coach."
He shook his head, looking like he'd lost his best friend.
"Her family would never accept me." "Do you not remember her sisters-in-law?"
Deidre asked.
"Yes," he nodded.
"The fact that we're all Americans is the only thing we have in common." Deidre leaned back and smiled.
"Boy, have you got a lot to catch up on."
"What do you mean?"
"Remember Camille?"
she asked, but didn't wait for him to respond.
"She was a reporter when she married Lacey's eldest brother, Julian."
There was no need to go into all that reporter pretending to be an actress bit.
And Tasha, the one you miraculously got sprung from jail? She nodded. She was an aspiring actress who made her living as a waitress when she married Andre. Yeah. You're joking, right? I can call and you can ask them for yourself. She offered her phone. He was silent again for a time. Then he stood and looked down at Deidre. I've got to talk to her. Is she at the house? Deidre nodded and stood. She was there when I left. As far as I know, she's not going anywhere before we head out to the airport. I hope you won't think I'm rude. He moved toward the door. But I've got to go. And then he was gone. Deidre sucked in a satisfying breath. Damn, she was good. She should do this shit for a living. Hook people up. She could be a matchmaker, yeah. Half seriously considering it, she left Nick's office and went to the bar. She deserved a drink. Besides, she needed to give Nick and Lacey time to make up. If this worked out the way she thought it would, she and Lacey wouldn't be going anywhere, which was good. She was not ready to leave California. Not yet. Who knows? Given a little time, she might find her own Americanized Prince Charming. Chapter 28. Inside the front door of Lacey's house, expensive luggage crowded the foyer, bringing it home to Nick that she was truly leaving. Damn, when the girl got an idea in her head, she didn't waste any time. Gerard appeared in the entryway of the living room. Ah, Mr. Matthews, will you be requiring my services after Mrs. Matthews returns to France? Mrs. Matthews. He'd never heard anybody call her that. It was kind of shocking and exhilarating. Once Nick got control of his senses and realized what Gerard had said, he laughed. Not a jovial laugh, but one of those, yeah, right, kind of laughs. That won't be necessary, Gerard. Hell, the guy probably made more money than Nick did. Very well, sir. Gerard looked like he wanted to say something, but decided against it, and backed out of sight. Oh, wait, Gerard. Nick rushed after him and caught up to him in the living room. Is Lacey upstairs? No, sir. Gerard shook his head. She left a while ago. I believe she said something about errands before heading to the airport. Nick looked around at her luggage. It was still here. But of course it was. Lacey wasn't the kind of person who dealt with her own luggage. She had staff at her disposal for that. Just when inferiority was about to overcome Nick, he swatted it away with a mental slap. He had more important things to do than get swallowed up by his own insecurities. He had to find her before that plane left the ground. Trouble was, he had no idea where to look. Nick tried Lacey's cell, but got nothing. He checked back in at the Hang 10, but Lacey hadn't been there. He stopped by a couple of other places he knew she liked, but they hadn't seen her either. He glanced at his watch. 5 o'clock. Was she already at the airport? He tried her cell again. Still nothing. Out of desperation, he called Deidre, and was surprised when she answered. Deidre, it's Nick. I've been looking for Lacey ever since I left you, but I can't find her anywhere. Is she with you now? No, she's not. Deidre's voice sounded puzzled. I thought you two would have met up by now. She was silent for a minute. You have to tell her that Ginny's not back, that you don't want her back. I don't want Ginny back, he insisted. Lacey doesn't know that. I know. He nodded, as if Deidre could see it. I would tell her if I could find her. Nick sucked in a breath, trying to quell the frustration that was starting to get the better of him. She's not at Hang 10? Deidre asked, and then started rattling off all the places she could think of that Lacey might be. Nick had the same response for each location that Deidre suggested. He'd already been there, and nobody had seen Lacey. At least not today. Well, what about Dean? She asked. Has he seen her? Dean. He was the only one Nick hadn't talked to. I'll give him a call. About to hang up, he added, Thanks for your help. He heard Deidre chuckle just before he clicked off the call.
Nick wasn't feeling all that lucky when he dialed Dean's number, but he was running out of options. When he heard the call connect, Nick said,
"Have you seen Lacey today?" "What's the matter?" Dean said, a little too cheerily. "You lose her?" "This is not funny," Nick said. "She's heading for France and—" He glanced at his watch. 5:30. "God, I'm so stupid. I should be at the airport right now." He shook his head. He'd never get to LAX by 6 o'clock. "Why would you want to be there?" "Her family's jet is taking off at 6. "Well, if it is," Dean said knowingly, "it'll be leaving without her." "And what makes you so sure of that?" "Because I'm looking at her right now." "She's with you?" That surprised Nick, and it showed in his tone. "No, she's not with me. She's just here." "What's she doing?" "She's sitting out in the common area on one of the couches." "I'll be there in 5 minutes. Can you keep her there?" "Of course I can keep her here," Dean laughed. The call ended with a charge of excitement blasting through Nick. Finally, maybe things were going to go his way. He gassed it and passed the car in front of him. Now that he knew where she was, he wanted to get there as soon as possible. Rolling into the parking lot of the community center, a sense of peace fell over Nick when he saw her car. He pulled into the first available space he came across, threw the truck in park, and headed inside. Lacey was still sitting on the couch in the common area where furniture was quartered off for informal chats. Off to the left were a half-dozen tables and some countertop desks along the far wall. This area of the community center reminded Nick of an internet cafe. A long hallway off to the right led back to the gymnasium where the kids played basketball. Lacey's back was to Nick. She was facing the wall where a dozen teenagers were gathered along the desks, utilizing, what was it? Computers? Damn, Lacey had really come through. Nick went quietly to her couch and sat next to her. "Did you know that I've been looking everywhere for you?" She sucked in a quick breath as she turned to him. "Nick." She let his name and nothing more roll off her tongue. "I would have never guessed in a million years that you'd be here." He laughed at himself. "I thought you were going back to France." She shrugged. "I missed my flight." Happy laughter escaped him. "You own the plane." "Well, not really," she said. "It belongs to my family." "Semantics." He tilted his head. "But either way, I'm glad. I would have had a hell of a time coming up with airfare to France." She giggled. When her eyes met his again, her face filled with sadness. "Where's Ginny?" "What you saw wasn't what it looked like." "It looked like you were kissing." "She's gone." He shook his head. "She's not the one I want." He hesitated for a moment, wanting very much to change the subject to something more agreeable, like him and Lacey. "Were you really going to disappear on me without a word?" She looked at him. Her lips moved, ever so slightly, like she was trying to get the words to come out of her head. And just when it was clear to Nick that no more words were coming, she kissed him, long and warm and satisfying. Nick took it as an open invitation to move in closer and cradled her face in his hands as he devoured her mouth urgently. "Wait," she whispered against his lips. "Are you sure about this?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." He moved back far enough to look at her, but kept her face cradled in his hands. "It snuck up on me so quietly I didn't even realize it was happening." "What?" She searched his eyes for an answer. "I fell in love with you," he said with a happy smile. "I know we're from very different worlds, and I'll never be able to give you all the material things someone more suited to you could do, but I can't imagine life without you. And if you'll have me, I'll do my best to make you happy." Epilogue. 6 weeks later. In the backyard of Lacey's California home, she could see in her peripheral vision her close friends and family sitting at elaborately decorated tables on the freshly manicured lawn. Lacey wondered if they were as happy for her as she was for herself. She hoped so.
She cut her eyes to the tables in the front row and into the faces of her immediate family, Mama and Papa. She let her gaze settle on Papa. He was smiling. She wouldn't have guessed that in a million years. Camille and Tasha, she decided, had softened him up to the idea of American in-laws. Somewhere in the far-off reaches of reality, she vaguely heard the announcement.
"Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Mr. and Mrs. Nick Matthews."
Nick squeezed her hands, bringing her wholly back into the moment as he drew her into his embrace for their first official dance as a couple. Almost instantly, the faint clicking of silverware against glasses flowed out among their guests. Seconds later, it grew louder. "They're clicking," Nick said, and she nodded. He gave her a devilish grin and whispered,
"I think they want us to kiss. We wouldn't want to disappoint them now, would we?"
She smiled, consumed with her love for him. She'd never imagined or even dreamed that she could be this happy. Nick's lips brushed against hers, and she parted her mouth slightly. Their breaths intermingled with the tips of their tongues ever so briefly, until they parted. After a suitable amount of time, people began to join them on the dance floor. First, Lacey's family, including her parents, Camille and Julien, Tasha and Andre, and then their friends. Maurice and Claudette sashayed up to them.
"Papa, Mama,"
Lacey greeted them with such joy. Nick had been happily basking in the love he'd seen shining for him in Lacey's eyes. He hoped that light never went out. He'd do everything within his power to make sure it didn't. Papa looked at Nick.
"Do you mind?"
he asked, offering the hand of his own wife to Nick. Not at all. Nick kissed Lacey on the cheek, relinquished her to her father, and smiled at Claudette as he took her hand.
"I'm honored to share the dance floor with you, Mrs. de Laurent," he said,
mangling the family's last name with his American pronunciation.
"Oh, don't you dare be so formal with me,"
Claudette giggled.
"You must call me Claudette."
Nick didn't argue. He simply smiled. He got the feeling that Claudette was a woman who was used to getting what she wanted.
"Might I be so bold?"
she asked cautiously. "By all means." Nick gave her a friendly nod.
"I get the feeling that you will do everything within your power to make my daughter happy,"
she said, as if she really believed it. "That you can count on," Nick said with absolute certainty.
"Even if it makes you uncomfortable?"
There was an unmistakable tension in her voice. He knew what she was getting at. Not necessarily the money so much as the lifestyle. Claudette wanted to make sure that he wasn't going to turn into one of those guys who would force his wife to live a deprived lifestyle just because he couldn't afford to give her more. Nick gave Claudette his trademark grin, which was usually effective in lightening up the girls at the restaurant. He shot her a wink and said, "I can assure you that whatever makes your daughter happy is going to be A-OK with me." Lacey and Maurice danced their way back over, and without a word, Maurice handed Lacey off to Nick and reclaimed his own wife.
"What did Mama say to you?"
she asked, settling happily back into Nick's arms. He liked her there. Nick shook his head, smiled, and said,
"She just wanted to welcome me to the family."
He twirled Lacey around a couple of times and laughed. "I'm just glad I didn't have to dance with your father." Lacey's laughter pealed out and mingled pleasantly with the music. "What was his fatherly advice?" Nick asked, and then let out a little nervous laugh, adding, "It's not too late to have him whacked?"
"Hell no,"
she said sharply.
"He wants to know when he's going to hear some good news."
She glanced away shyly, her cheeks tainting crimson.
"We've been married 5 minutes, and he wants me knocked up already."
Camille, Tasha, and Nick, most of all Nick, were wearing off on Lacey. She was really starting to sound like an American. At least, she was using more and more American slang. If Papa heard her say knocked up, it would probably give him a heart attack.
"Are you happy, Mrs. Matthews?"
Nick asked.
"I couldn't be happier,"
she said breathlessly.
"Good.
He flashed her a dazzling smile and drew her closer. "I wouldn't have it any other way."
"And you, Mr. Matthews," she inquired, "are you happy?"
"From the moment you walked into my life." He brushed his lips against hers with a light, teasing kiss, just enough to leave her breathless, anticipating the honeymoon. Lacey had often looked upon her brothers over the last few years with envy. She not only envied the way they looked at their wives, but the way their wives looked at them in return. She'd never held out much hope that she might one day experience such joy. Lacey had always thought she'd have to live vicariously through her brothers. But thanks to their uncle, Edouard Renault, who was indirectly responsible for her meeting Nick, fate had indeed smiled upon Lacey. She glanced up into her husband's enthralling brown eyes. The sound of it, "my husband," made her giddy inside. But there, in his eyes, she saw a deep, exhilarating love for her. He scooped her up in his arms, sweeping her off her feet. "Are you ready?" he asked. "For what?" she giggled. He carried her past her parents, whose faces were filled with joy, on past Camille and Julien, Tasha and Andre, and the kids. Everyone had beaming smiles. "Say goodbye," he said, as they headed inside the house. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice full of happiness. He carried her through the house and out the open front door. When he stopped at the limo waiting in the driveway, he said, "Our honeymoon." He gave her a scandalous grin, then winked, saying, "We've got to practice." She asked in an almost serious tone, "What are we practicing for?" "Making grandbabies." This has been The Marriage Fix, Billionaire Games, Book 3. Written by Sandra Edwards. Narrated by Randy Fuller. Copyright 2013 by Sandra Edwards. Production copyright 2015 by Sandra Edwards.